going to take you live now to a news conference in Canberra. The Greens are about to outline a plan to protect editorial independence of Fairfax.
A position where it's having to make difficult commercial decisions, and I think we should pause to note that with 1,900 people potentially losing their jobs, those 1,900 people are worthy of as much of the nation's attention as people who work in the car sector or who work in manufacturing. That's 1,900 jobs and 1,900 families that deserve our support as much as we were able to give it. Another piece to the puzzle that's extremely disturbing to many of us in Parliament and also to many in the community is the increasing push by the world's richest woman, Gina Rinehart, to take over not only substantial ownership in Fairfax, but to control its editorial direction. To date, there's been many reports that Gina Rinehart has not denied that she's been unwilling to sign on to the Age's very strong Charter of Independence. And when one looks at the comments that Gina Rinehart has made, it's clear that she's wanting to control what to date has been a very important and independent newspaper and house of journalism for the purposes of influencing the public debate. Now, a strong and healthy democracy relies on well-resourced, independent journalism that can hold both governments to account, but also hold some of the country's most powerful individuals to account. Now, I don't want to wake up in Melbourne every morning to find that my choice is between reading what Rupert Murdoch thinks and what Gina Rinehart thinks. If we move to a situation in this country where some of the country's current or former expatriates' richest people are determining what we read every day, and that then in turn influences the other media, we are entering very dangerous territory. It is just absolutely essential for the future of debate in Melbourne and in Sydney and across the whole country that we have strong independent media, and that includes Fairfax retaining its editorial independence, which is a big selling point, and it's why people want to read these newspapers and go online to read it. We've heard over the last couple of days similar sentiments being expressed from various sides of politics. Well, the time for talk is rapidly growing to an end. It is very clear that decisions are being made in a very short period of time, and that we are concerned that unless we act quickly, then editorial independence and the role of well-resourced independent journalism in Australia is under threat. So I'd like to ask Scott now to explain what we are intending to do about it.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, look, in the last 24 hours since the decision by Fairfax has come to light, we've had comments from coalition senators that I think have been quite destructive and distracting, trying to link the issue of job insecurity at Fairfax with the carbon price. But we've also had some quite constructive comments from Mr Turnbull and this morning from Senator Conroy, the Communications Minister, on charters of editorial independence. And that, as Adam's indicated, is one of the reasons that Fairfax has such a strong brand and such a strong readership. I'm writing to both the Minister and the Shadow Spokesperson this afternoon to invite them to bring these reforms forward so that they are actually mandated, so that in fact that becomes something that somebody like Ms Rinehart isn't invited to do, but is required to do, as a consequence of taking a substantial stake or putting herself on the board of a major masthead such as this. Now, reforms like this we might have got to in terms of, for example, a long-mooted public interest test as a part of the convergence review package, which may or may not be legislated in coming months. We don't believe there's time. I think there is a real urgency to this, and yesterday's announcement really sharpens the urgency of bringing such an instrument forward. So I'll be writing to both of those gentlemen this afternoon to test their views on whether or not they would support a legislative solution that would bind directors of such companies and people on the board of such companies, of the large the large media corporations, to commit to not obstructing the journalists from doing their work. And that's really what we're asking for. And that's in place at Fairfax. You can argue about its effectiveness, as you could with a legislated solution. But effectively, we don't want to see proprietors and the management of these big media companies obstructing the work that you all do every day in writing the stories that we rely on effectively to keep this building honest.
Can I ask,
Thank you.
Are you thinking of a regulation, and if so, how would you enforce it? Because I imagine that Ms Reinhardt could afford pretty much any fine you might like to impose.
I think that's an excellent question, David. And whether it be by regulation, whether it be an amendment to the Broadcasting Services Act, which I think is the direction that the Convergence Review was heading in, or whether it be by some other instrument and in terms of penalties and so on, those are exactly the issues that you'd want to tease out. We're not looking to a knee-jerk solution here. We're looking to something that would have integrity and that would actually serve working journalists and the general public. And those are the kind of questions that we want to put on the table.
Fundamentally, you accept that the actual change in the industry is inevitable, that there's no holding back that tide. Do you have any proposals or suggestions that you would try to hold back that tide?
Yeah, look, I think holding back the tide in this instance is going to be extraordinarily difficult, and there have been comments over the last 24 hours about whether or not this is the twilight of the age of print. Now, that being the case, I think reflects on Adam's comments about very much looking after the workforce in the print shop, for whom there may be no other option apart from reskilling, and they're going to need help both from management and potentially from the government to do that if those jobs simply aren't there outside Fairfax. What I'm hoping that we're not looking at, however, is the twilight of quality journalism, and that's a separate public policy issue that we really need to take on.
In terms of the 1,900 jobs at Fairfax and possible job cuts at News Limited, do you think that quality journalism is under threat with these sorts of numbers going?
I think it's under threat as long as we've got this clash between the idea of media companies as investment assets to be shunted around the table like poker chips, and media companies as providing an essential public service in a functioning democracy. That's the real threat here, and that's the kind of threat that we see with the statements by Ms Reinhardt and some of her colleagues and allies, that they're effectively going to be trying to turn couple of the most important newspaper mastheads in the country into mining industry newsletters. That's the threat here. There's the business model threat, which we believe absolutely can survive into the age of the internet. And if Fairfax had been a bit more creative over the last decade, perhaps we wouldn't be seeing such a sharp proposal over the last 24 hours. That, I think, is entirely possible, but we've got a separate issue here with the idea of mining magnates openly proposing to use these media assets as a vehicle for their commercial ambitions.
Mr. Maddish, are you saying that the Fairfax management have been a bit more creative in the past years? Are you saying Fairfax has been mismanaged?
I think there's been a lot of criticism over the last 24 hours from people who have been at the helm of the company, people who've been close, and not just directed at Fairfax but at the newspaper industry in particular, about seeing the threat of the internet coming, about letting, for example, revenue sources from advertising slip away and not seizing those opportunities when they were there. Now, I know that's easy in hindsight to put back to people who were there at the time, but it's not like we didn't see the internet coming.
You say that you're not looking for a knee-jerk solution, but you would need to amend the Act within probably these two sitting weeks. How likely is that?
I think that would be exceptionally difficult, and that potentially is a serious rush. We could look at introducing legislation during this fortnight, depending on the willingness of the Minister and the shadow spokesperson to actually seriously grapple with the issue. We'll need to see a proposal that we can put some proposals on the table. We'll just have to see whether those ideas are taken up.
And would that actually address the Gina Reinhardt issue in time?
Well, we would hope so. We absolutely would hope so. We've got to also remember that there are some hard decisions here for Fairfax, that this is not necessarily an issue that's going to be entirely solved in Parliament.
Do you think that the penalties and sanctions that you could impose, would you think that fines would be enough, or do you think that the legislation would have to be strong enough to, say, force somebody to divest their share if they breached a code or something like that.
Those sort of solutions were hinted at in the Convergence Review and even in Finkelstein to a degree. And again, that's going to be a judgment call as we go through the process. But I think you're quite right. We're looking at arguably the richest woman in the world, who could buy a lot more than a 19% stake in Fairfax if she chose to.
And will you be asking Senator Conroy to introduce other changes to media law at the same time as you're asking for this?
I think we need to work through those aspects of the media review and the Convergence Review that can be realistically brought forward. I think, for example, I hope there'll be non-controversial aspects of those packages, such as support for public and community broadcasters, other ways that we can encourage media diversity in Australia, Australian content. There are a range of issues that I think were quite well canvassed in the Convergence Review that we should bring forward, but we've got a very urgent issue right on our doorstep.
Great. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thanks, folks.
The Greens, they're expressing their concerns about the changes we're seeing at Fairfax. For years now, Fairfax has been governed by this independent charter of editorial independence. Now, so far, Gina Rinehart hasn't signed up to that. There are reports suggesting she does not want to be limited by that independent charter. We've already heard from the Communications Minister, Stephen Conroy, today. He's been urging Gina Rinehart to sign up to this, saying that if she was to directly interfere or breach that charter, it would actually lead to a crisis of confidence among the readership. The Greens there were arguing that this is something that should actually be mandated through legislation, and it sounded like they were open to ideas as to exactly how to go down that path. That's something that I would doubt the major parties would be keen to do in terms of actually mandating that, but both of the major parties have made it clear that they would like to see Fairfax retaining that independence when it comes to editorial decisions. Of course, this is a developing story. We're going to see a lot more reaction from different union groups as well today on this Fairfax story. Right now, though, Lee and Vanessa, back to you.
Thanks, Ash. Across Australia and New Zealand,